there are children that are in need of protection, and the state has the authority to intervene in the family home to take children into protective custody when there's evidence of abuse. But unfortunately, there are also instances where people fall through the cracks with very tragic results, and we're going to hear some very sad stories here today. The panel, oh, just 1 second, our third panelist is coming in right now.
You know what? I can't.
All right, can you try again?
We have,
Yeah, just try again. Yeah.
I forgot earphones. Can you believe that? I'm sorry. I have to put better time. I just don't know.
We're getting our third panelist in by Skype. There's some technical problem there, so we'll be trying to get in a moment. There he is. So, we have Larry McConnell, who's joining us from Whitecourt, British Columbia, Alberta. Larry McConnell is a lawyer who's representing a woman named Jamie Sullivan, who's a woman whose 4-month-old baby, Lavonda, died 6 days into foster care, and he's going to be sharing with us her story. And our second panelist is Lyndon Parakin, who's just sitting at the far left there. And Lyndon Parakin is Executive Director of Autism Calgary, and he's going to be sharing with us his experiences as Director of this society, and he's going to be sharing with us some of the problems which surround perceptions and prejudices and biases against not only persons who are suffering from autism, but also persons who are living in challenged socioeconomic circumstances and who lose their children because of biases against them as systemic to the child protection system. And our third panelist is joining us from, he's come from Abbotsford, British Columbia, and his name is Derek Hoare. And Derek is the father of an autistic child named Ein, and he's going to be sharing with us his very sad story and how he lost Ein to child protection authorities in British Columbia, and how he's had to wait for 16 months for his day in court to challenge why she was seized. The format is such: we'll hear from each of our speakers for about 15 minutes, and then we'll turn things over to the audience for a question and answer period. And during the question and answer period, please, I'd ask you to keep your questions as short as possible to give as many people a chance to speak as possible. And I know that we're joined by various advocates for children's rights, so please feel free to join in the conversation and share with us your experiences with the system. One final point of order. Hi, Larry. Yeah, you're on. We've got you on, no problem. So we'll just carry on, okay? He's not getting anything, Stephanie. We're going to have to carry on without Larry McConnell for the time being. I'm not sure why we're not able to patch him in. So I'd like to hear then from Lyndon first to explain who you are and why you're here.
As you've heard, I'm Executive Director of Autism Calgary, which was a very big career change in my life. I started off my life as a software developer for oil reservoir simulation software and 3D modeling. But in 2000, the first of my 2 children to eventually be diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder made a big change in my life, where ultimately by 2005 I took a career shift. One of the parents has to become the autism expert in the family, and that's when a family survives the challenges and stresses of having someone with a severe disability to care for. I became the autism expert for my family. I'm lucky that my wife has a professional career. So I'm really very lucky relative to other families because I now get paid to become knowledgeable in autism and to learn about how to protect and defend the best quality of life for my children, and to share that knowledge with other families, which I attribute my skills to what I've learned from other families more than anything else, more than the other intervention. I'm learning a lot of the challenges they face through systems of support and navigation. So as you will guess, a big function of Autism Calgary is giving families the capacity to be strong, independent self-advocates. We have family support groups, we have a lot of volunteer and staff that help to provide individual counseling to families, not professional counseling, but shared family experiences and peer-to-peer networking. Myself, I take on a big role with the charity in helping families with more of the role where they need to do stronger advocacy, maybe seek legal counsel, usually using other avenues of advocacy that are in legislation, like, for example, under the Family Support for Children with Disabilities Act, there is a legal appeal process, which I'm quite familiar with. And also similarly with the Persons with Developmental Disabilities Board for adult funding. I'm going to tell you a little bit about autism, then I'm going to cite, just to get you to understand the spectrum, because I understand there are people that don't necessarily understand that here. Then I'm going to finish off with some specific examples where I feel there's been violations of rights that might not necessarily apply to the Children's Act, but give you a really good sense of understanding of how the symptoms of autism relate to these inaccurate assumptions that people might make, leaving vulnerability to legislation like the Children's Act. Autism is usually a generic term for something called an autism spectrum disorder. It's a spectrum simply because there's a variety of ways in which a multitude of symptoms can impact a person where it results in a condition that's seen as a disability. All of the symptoms, from my point of view as a parent living with it, are all very much natural reactions and responses all human beings have to adverse reactions in their life. And it's the degree to which you have each of them where it satisfies diagnostic criteria. The biggest and most common area that a person with an autism spectrum has is an area of communication, which also includes functional communication as well as nonverbal social communication. Right across the spectrum, people who are impacted by autism will have trouble with a lot of the nonverbal communication we use, facial gestures, emotions. Across the spectrum, it impacts their success in social situations. Autism can affect cognitive functioning, which may or may not involve intelligence quotients, but can simply imply emotional intelligence and impacts to their executive functions to daily living. So ultimately, in the cognitive area, there are impacts across the spectrum, but not necessarily intellectual. Most people with autism suffer with some form of sensory dysfunction. They're either oversensitive or undersensitive to certain sensory input. Most people with autism have some impact to motor coordination and motor planning. And ultimately, these can accumulate to their self-help skills and adaptive function in the community. Is classically seen as a behavioral disorder, but as a parent I say behavior is really what's reflected by what a human being living with those challenges, how you have to adapt, to live successfully in your environment. So some of the behaviors that are stereotyped to autism are repetitive physical and verbal behaviors, rocking, repetitive word phrases, for sometimes calming, for a multitude of different reasons, an insistence on routine and structure, an obsession on topics of interest, or odd attachments to toys, objects, or sameness. People with autism are often very literal thinkers because they don't understand social language. Figures of speech often are really puzzling and fearful for them because they don't necessarily understand how language is used in a multitude of settings to mean multiple things. So they're very literal with language. They can be seemingly unpredictable with meltdowns or shutdowns. I also want people, that kind of ends my descriptor of autism, the closed notes version. The term high and low functioning is commonly used, but not to be, I don't want people to be misled because many people that are high functioning autism, maybe a diagnostic like Asperger's, can actually be quite profoundly and severely disabled and living successfully in the society. Some people that are considered very severely disabled with autism may actually have a much higher quality of life. They may not have language, they may have learned and being given the appropriate supports in the community and their family, their quality of life is very, very high. So to illustrate with some of, or before I illustrate some of the vulnerabilities that I see when families come to me when they've seen challenges to the human rights, I do want to mention one of the more, the common topic that's going to be brought up when Derek speaks is about bolting or wandering behaviors. This is one common thing where there's a misperception on what it might mean for a child to run away, and possibly at any age. A 2 or 3-year-old may run away or may bolt off into traffic, and that's kind of common for that age level. This kind of behavior can carry through for someone with autism to much older ages, where people are likely to think, why is this child running? Obviously from something really bad, and then they might look at maladaptive behaviors and jump to conclusions. People who wonder, recent Autism Speak studies, and to isolate something I didn't mention as well is the social isolation of people with autism and their families. 65% of families by a recent Autism Speak study indicate that families are prevented from attending and enjoying activities outside the home. So families and individuals with autism often live in social isolation as a unit. Bolting is often a sensory dysfunction response. 30% of the people in the Autism Speak studies attributed escaping or bolting to sensory dysfunction. 30% attributed bolting to pursuit of special interest topics. 30% said it was from escape on demands or anxieties. But I'm digressing, so I'll go into some of the examples because it's such a short time to speak on a topic I can talk for 5 hours on. An example of vulnerabilities for people higher functioning autism that I saw, I'm thinking of a parent of a youth in a public education system where the school decided, looking at the child, seemingly high functioning, that this child did not in fact have autism, and what they needed was to have someone a little bit stern, pushing them harder to work successfully in school. After this went on for 6 months, this youth would run away when forced to do public speaking with their social disability and their fear of being rejected. This pattern of behavior occurred to the point that the family was struggling to have the youth return to school, and it often took days to calm them with the resulting withdrawal behaviors that this young person had. The school reported the family for truancy, and the family were put before a truancy hearing. Much smaller, but I found it very hard as an advocate to support this family at a truancy hearing because families seem to have no rights to speak. That's one example of vulnerabilities, misperceptions and lack of understanding, a lack of training in people that provide supportive professional expertise to people with autism. Teachers learn 10 to 15 minutes about special needs, and there's an optional course about individual program planning. It's an optional course in Alberta that just gives a general global developmental delay in a child, a general learning disability, non-existing type disabling condition. So teachers don't know about autism. I can also think of a young man whose family called me. This man was in college and in his 4th year of studies, straight A's to his 2nd and 3rd year, excepting for courses where there were some social demands where he scraped by with D's. But in the last year of studies of this program, there was a lot of group work, lots of intense group where his marks dropped down to D's. He was told in one particular course to critique his peers in a particular project they had done. Now, I mentioned that people with autism can be very literal thinkers. This man was brutal when he critiqued his peers. So much so, he was charged with non-academic misconduct because of how he continued to be particularly critical, and he took it very literally and was very repetitive about it. As the anxieties mounted, he was presented a plan for which would allow him to say in school that articulated behaviors that he was supposed to live up to, described with intense social complexity that he did not understand whatsoever. It escalated badly enough that he feared he'd be removed from school, and he resorted to criminal activity to try and keep himself in that program and tried to remove an assignment he had just submitted after hearing about new rules he had to live up to, and he was caught trying to erase information off of his teacher's hard drive. They brought in counselors on campus to talk to him because his behavior was so unusual. They feared for for their safety, and a counselor asked him if he had ever thought of hurting another person. If you ask that of someone with higher functioning autism, they will tell you the truth. Who in here, when you have been stressed, have not thought, I could slap that person? Well, if you have high functioning autism, you're going to say, yeah, I thought I hit him. Later that afternoon, that young man was taken away in a straitjacket to the Panoka Center. Illustrating this further on how there are misperceptions about higher functioning people with autism right now, I'm talking about that. We had some of our presenters talk to Police Diversity's training unit in Calgary, which were excited that they were open to a presentation from us. We brought 2 adults with high functioning autism to come and talk about what it was like for them to have a meltdown or to have a shutdown in a high state of anxiety, particularly when police are involved. A number of the police officers afterwards came up and talked and said, what you described to us is how we would perceive the risk of excited delirium, which is behavior on being high on drugs. And quite often that leads for a suspect to be brought down by high aggression with officers protecting their safety and using taser guns, which would be the worst thing to do for an individual with autism, as that would elevate their anxiety and bring them at the risk of harming themselves and other people, where their symptoms really were not putting anyone in danger. They just needed someone to support them and provide privacy to calm down. So higher functioning youth and adults are vulnerable to bullying. They're vulnerable to being too coerced into doing illegal activities misguided by perceptions of friendship, because higher functioning people with autism have been starved and never had friendship in their lives. People with autism, their anxieties and stresses can result into them leading to aggressive and ultimately criminal behaviors if the support that supports have been absent in their lives. Their lack of eye contact, unusual emotional displays can often be perceived as guilt or symptoms of being abused by a family. Examples like for higher impacted people with autism, like you're going to hear today. I can also think of a situation where a family was trying to advocate for supports under Alberta's Children's Services legislation, under an area called Family Support for Children with Disability. A mother confronted me and phoned me and told me that she had had 80 hours of psychology on her intensive intervention team, and her psychologist needed more time that year to address some very self-destructive behaviors the child had. This young girl of about 8 years old would get stressed and chew her arms until she bled, requiring stitches. It happened recurrently, and she was denied more than 80 hours of psychology support. Needless to say, this mother, when you are a parent facing these kinds of insurmountable odds, you are not at your best when you advocate. You become angry, you become hostile, you become difficult to deal with because people aren't listening to you. This mom had a phone call with her caseworker, and she said to the caseworker, my child is bleeding right now. Are you going to allow this to continue? And the caseworker said, well, what are you going to do about it? And mom said, well, it's none of your effing business. That mother thereafter was faced with a 2-year investigation of child protection, where every human being involved in that family's life were phoned to ask if they were suitable as parents. A parent to me that is a hero for the level of advocacy they have done for their child. Another parents that called me last summer, less reluctant to take direct support from me because in fear of it making the situation worse. They had a young man with autism, sort of moderately functioning. They became concerned that their daughter was at risk with their son's behavior. They were at a loss of what to do. They asked for certain kinds of professional supports, and they were misguided and told no such supports existed. They said then their only option was an out-of-home placement. They were also misguided and not told that under Alberta's rights for children, under the Family Support for Children with Disabilities, there are supported parenting arrangements where a parent doesn't have to give up their legal rights. Their caseworker told them their only option was to sign away their guardianship and have their child put into private care in a group home facility. So they reluctantly did that in fear of their daughter because they couldn't get the supported help to make their son's life high enough to leave their daughter safe. Within 6 months, they had phone calls from their son His state of support was very poor. He was put in a group home of people that didn't understand autism. He was the victim of bullying from other children in the program who had other challenges, but his needs were not met, nowhere near as well as his needs were met with his family. It took that family 3 years to get their child back. Another common situation of loss of or involvement in child protection that comes to my attention, and probably there are a lot more cases because these are often single mothers of low socioeconomic classes. So 3 of the mothers I did come into contact with were at the stage of getting their child returned back to them. But what I'd like to really remark on is the level of expertise they were expected to have to get their child back seemed to me to be quite ridiculous. So you can imagine a young single mother, maybe rough around the edges because life has been challenging for a multitude of reasons, and their child has not yet been diagnosed with autism. Their child is 2 or 3, has unbelievable outbursts and meltdowns in the store, where mom, just like me, when my son was first diagnosed, had no idea what to do, and you resort to what limited parental skills you have on behavior, conventional behavioral approaches, which have no impact and escalate things. You appear very dysfunctional. So these single mothers lost their child, and after many years of trying to get their children back, they were put in front of a judge and said, you know, the child's now being diagnosed with autism. There's some indication that it wasn't mother that caused the behavior. But that mother has to prove that she has the skills to look after an autistic child. That mother has never been connected with my charity. That mother has never been given program unit funding on Alberta education. The mother has not been told about the Family Support for Children with Disabilities Act, respite to give her relief, counseling for the family, and she's supposed to stand up in front of a judge to tell them how she can care for that child. Those mothers don't usually access me or any of the people in my network because they don't have those capacities. They're facing insurmountable odds and they don't know how to connect to the community. When they do, we supported letters of support to the judge indicating that the family were disadvantaged and that they have now accessed the right community resources to have what they need. So I think I'll end my discussion there. I think I've given you a sense of autism and some samples of where rights of individuals and families are interfered because of perceptions of professionals and misunderstandings of what having a social disability might introduce. Thank you.
Thanks so much for sharing your insights with us. And we'll hear now from Derek.
Hi everyone, thanks for having me. Thank you, Brian. I guess the best place to start, since everyone probably has not heard my case, is to give you guys a quick sort of overview of what happened to me and my family. I'm a single dad. I have 3 kids. 2 of my children, my 2 youngest, are both diagnosed with severe autism. My daughter's been removed from my care, and what happened is June 12th of last year, my daughter climbed up in our tree house, and she hopped over the fence and played Goldilocks in her neighbor's house in the yard. I called the police. The police came, basically told us to stay inside, and they were going to start a 0-point search and blocked everything off for grids and went to look for my little girl. And the neighbor whose yard she was playing in happened to be asleep, and so she was able to play there sort of undisturbed for a couple hours. When he woke up and found her, she was quickly returned to me. 4 days later, on June 16th, the ministry showed up at my home, and they offered me a voluntary care agreement where they wanted to remove my daughter to have her undergo psychiatric assessment. This was based on the basis that my child in the school had uncontrollable behaviors. They could not get instructional control over her. She had been isolated. They built a small room in the back of the classroom. Inside of that little room, they built another little room about 5 by 5 or 6 by 6, lined with blue gym mats. If Ayn had an outburst at school, they would determine whether or not they felt she was over or understimulated. If they thought she was overstimulated, they'd put her in the padded room. If they thought she was understimulated, they would let her listen to music in a rocking chair with a plush blanket. In effect, what this did was taught my daughter that have an outburst and you don't have to do what they tell you. You get to go, sit and listen to music. When they arrived at my home with this paperwork for a voluntary care agreement, I heard right away that she'd be removed from my care and refused. I didn't know what to do. I immediately called legal counsel. There was nothing I could do. She wasn't at home at the time. They told me they would simply go to the school and remove her if I did not sign it. I still refused. 5 days later, I was given a hearing in front of a judge, but because I refused to consent to the removal, the hearing was moved to September 1st, which was then double booked to move to September 26th. In this period of time, my daughter was placed into an acute psychiatric facility. She was put on 6 different neuroleptic antipsychotics, double the dose of chlorpromazine, which is marketed as a chemical lobotomizer. They did this all under the guise that she had some dual diagnosis, that there was some other condition acting alongside of the autism, and they wanted to get to the bottom of it. I tried to argue as rationally as I could with them that this can't be the case, that these behaviors are not exhibited in the home, that mental illness is not geographically specific, and if she's good in the home and not good in the school, we should look at how they're responding to her behaviors and not simply drug this child. The hospital where she was placed was told not to contact me. The hospital where she was placed was told that if I contacted them to deny her existence. I was told nothing. I got a phone call from them for the first time on July 4th. And they basically told me, or outright told me, your daughter has been crying for you. Could you please bring us in a picture of yourself to help her stop crying? That's the first I heard of my daughter. When she was discharged from the hospital, I got a copy of the hospital discharge. They refused to keep her there, saying this is an autistic girl, this is a normal, healthy autistic child, we're not keeping her here. At that point in time, I thought finally this is over, and that they would return her to me. They looked me in the face and said, we're still going ahead with psychiatric treatment. We're just going to put her somewhere until we can get her residential psychiatric treatment. So on day 45, an autism expert finally got to look at her file, and the autism expert said, this is autism. This is not a psychiatric aid, this is autism. You can't do this to her. So they realized at that point. They didn't return her to me. There was no apology, sorry, this is autism. We didn't see that. I continued to fight, and because of my stance of refusing to consent to her removal, because of my stance against the ministry and taking this publicly, what has happened is the judicial process sort of creeps along. So my first hearing was on September 26th, where I was granted a brief interaction to speak, though I couldn't actually speak, my lawyer could. But you're not allowed to dispute anything they say. The way the system is structured at presentation, whatever the director says, the court must believe this. This is in order to protect the child just in case. After refusing to consent there, I was granted a judicial case conference on January 22nd of this year, at which time I demanded a trial. I was given a trial, which takes place December 7th of this year, more than 18 months after, or just under 18 months after her removal, where I will perhaps get to argue why it is I believe they should not have ever removed my daughter from my care. In this time, I still have 2 kids. My child with autism, which remains with me, Lyric, he has distantly more severe autism than his sister. We continue to function. They have no idea what has happened or why this has happened. Cars pull up in front of the house and they're terrified. The reason why I'm glad Brian called me here today is because the implications of what's happened to my child are very broad-reaching. I think that they affect every Canadian, though a lot of people look at this and they're like, well, it's just a little disabled girl. Of course, to me, she's not. And I think to every other Canadian, she should not be, and we should see what policies are being enacted in order to do this sort of thing to Canadians. Because my daughter lives with a reality here that you and I don't live with. The reality is that you and I go to the store, we go to the library, we go wherever we're going to go, we do our daily activities. We don't think people can come and just drag us off. It took 6 adults to load my daughter into a van. She fought them, she screamed, she cried. The hospital very clearly writes in the reports how she assaulted the unit, how she just wanted to go home. She was expecting to go home. Okay, this is a little girl who now gets dragged on to school, put in a van, taken to a sterile environment, and injected with chemicals in order to sedate her. We don't live in that reality. And I think that as a Canadian, we have to be protected. As a human, we have to be protected. against these sorts of actions. There has to be a reason why you're going to do this. And it can't be some malign reason without any investigation into, does this child require help? What is this child's circumstances? These people had no idea what autism was. They didn't look into the home. They didn't come do an interview in the home until day 115 after presentation. And my little girl is still gone. And they just sit there and keep saying their plan is to return her to me. That's what they tell the court. Oh, we're planning on returning her. Months have gone by where I don't hear anything from them. Literally months have gone by. We've gone through 6 different social workers. Each one comes on and says, I just need to review the file. I just got the file. I haven't had a chance. I got to look it over. You got to give me time to catch up to speed. And by the time they caught up to speed, they're moved out and someone else has moved in. And I can only fathom what other families are going through when this happens to them. And, you know, I've been able to garner public support. I've been able to draw the public into my story and be able to articulate what's happening to my little girl. But I want people to understand that this is not isolated. We're watching an incremental approach that is happening more and more and more. These things could not have happened 30 years ago, which are happening now. And in another 10 years or another 20 years, we're going to see things happening that we didn't think were possible now. And people need to wake up to the reality that this is happening. And people think, well, there's mechanisms in place to protect you. And yet, the mechanisms that are in place are not there to protect you. They're there to make the whole process seem legitimized. The reality is that when this happens to a parent, there is nothing you can do. 2 processes begin underway. One is ministerial, the other one is judicial, and you have virtually no control over either one. I'm trying to fight as hard as I can to get her back. My first hearing is December 7th. And, or my first hearing for my temporary custody order, which will be 18 months in care. The law states that the government can take your child without you really having anything to say about it. But they can do so only for 18 months under temporary custody. I had hoped this meant that they would have needed to either return my daughter to me after 18 months, or that they would have had to fight for permanent custody of my daughter. They're now playing legal semantics and saying, oh no, we don't have temporary custody of your daughter. We have what's called interim custody of your daughter because no order has ever been granted. The 18-month clock will start after this trial, which begins December 7th, but doesn't conclude until mid-February. And then months later, a judge can come down with an order, potentially granting the ministry 90 days, which they asked for this 90 days back on October 22nd. It's been an absolute nightmare. And I'd really like to discuss the variety of elements that I think we're going to touch upon this. Laundering has been mentioned as the inciting force for my daughter's removal. The reality is that wandering was almost the trigger, but it was like there was something else already present. And obviously what that was her behavior in the school. Because that was largely the mitigating factors which they brought up in court. They try to present my household as, well, this is a single dad with 3 kids and 2 of them are autistic. This is so overwhelming for one person to handle, okay, without looking into the home, without asking any family, any friends, nothing. I don't even know exactly how to describe how that could possibly make you feel, because you do your best for your kids, you defend your kids, and when you have a disabled child, you're put into that position more often than you are with your neurotypical children. You have to advocate for these kids because the reality is they're receiving what amounts to glorified babysitting. My daughter was taught up to grade 1 in school. That was it. Every year she'd go in, they would teach her to sing ABCs. She was higher functioning than her peers. Right? At home, we taught her, we had her past to grade 6 level, but they would never do anything. All they would do was lock her in this little room where she was kept isolated. And you advocate. We need to realize that treating a child in this manner that they have, where now they've got her medicated on 2 drugs. She is back in school, though has no academic program in front of her. She's basically allowed to do what she wants, kept calm, so that they can say, look, she's improving in school. We're not seeing as many bad behaviors, so clearly the child is improving. We have a situation here where this is the state's first decision on how to deal with autistic kids who are tangerine in schools, is medicating them. And they're using antipsychotics on them. And we're seeing this happen more and more and more and more. We have to make Canadians aware that this is what is occurring this is what can occur. Because I don't think that people think this can occur. I don't think they think it is occurring. I've never heard of a case like mine where only one child is removed. I've asked for parental capacity assessments and denied. They don't want to see whether or not I can handle doing it, because that would mean what they had done was wrong. And I'm left in a situation where I'm trying to argue to nobody that, listen, just return her to me. There wasn't these problems. I don't know what to say without even breaking into tears, really, about how it makes one feel when they've done this to you, and the fear that you live in when cars drive by slowly, when someone pulls in your driveway, my kids running and hiding, right, thinking that they can be next and they can be taken. And I've confronted the CPS in the past, saying, you know, I care for my kids, I love my kids, I have nothing to fear from you people. You have no power over me. There's nothing you can do. Now, this confrontational attitude has also probably led to what has occurred with me. Because 3 years prior to my removal, which was my interaction with the ministry prior to this, was involving my neurotypical son. And I think it's important background information because it may get people to understand, well, why out of nowhere would they come and do this to you? It doesn't make sense, right? My neurotypical son was 10 years old, and he would play in the neighborhood park about 3 minutes away from our house, 2 minutes away. And one day a neighbor who lived near the park called the police and said, oh, there's a boy there unsupervised. The police came and talked to him, drove him home. The policy was if police are involved with the child, the ministry needs to be contacted. And they came to my house and told me that my child is not allowed to play outside unsupervised. I said, he's 10 years old, the park around the corner. I'm a single dad, I got 2 autistic kids, we can't all just pack up. You know, he's a good boy, he doesn't get in any trouble, nor did he ever get in any trouble. He's allowed to go to the park. And they said, no, he's not allowed to go to the park. And that it's a community standard, and the community standard must be met. And I said, well, the Charter of Rights and Freedom says we're allowed to move about this country. You know, he's allowed. And they said no. I went and got my laptop. I opened up my laptop and held it open to them and said, I want you to tell Canadians that. I want you to tell them that 10-year-old kids cannot go play outside unsupervised, right? And they left. They left my house without saying a word. When they came back to my house to discuss the matter again, I went and got my laptop right away to record. They left again without saying a word. I received a phone call saying since I am being uncooperative, they would like me to do a future risk assessment. This is all 3 years prior to my removal. I did the future risk assessment, which I assume I passed because I didn't hear from them. Now, when I was removed, a lot of the judge, a lot of the lawyers, the people around me were saying, well, why didn't they try to put help in the home? And if their concern was your ability to handle the kids, why not offer services? The family, or myself rather, was portrayed initially and still as uncooperative. I'm uncooperative because I want to record these interactions with them. Every time I do have an interaction with them, this is basically the first thing I hear is, we have reason to believe you're recording us. I want you to know that you don't have my permission to record this. So I'm left in this position where, though I'm not uncooperative at all, as a matter of fact, I'm sitting here trying to advocate for my child. I'm more than willing to cooperate. Because I want to record them and portrayed as such, so the first and only action that they can take is to remove the child and place her into what was a psychiatric facility. So we just had pre-trial 2 days ago, actually, where for the first time I'm now representing myself. Of course, we were scheduled on a remand date where there was no time to hear the case, so it has now been moved to November 23rd. So that's where the case stands today, and I'm ripped roaring and ready to go to discuss the implications of my daughter's case and what this means on a variety of issues.
All right, well, thanks very much, Derek, for sharing with us that really sad story. And thanks again, Lyndon, also for sharing with us your insights. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get our lawyer in through some technical difficulties, but as some would say, if it was meant to be, it will happen. If it wasn't meant to be, it didn't happen, inshallah. In any event, perhaps it's best that we did hear stories, because I think a lot of times we forget that these are real people with real feelings who are being subject to actions by the state. And there's a real power imbalance there. And as Derek has so eloquently pointed out, We have this Charter of Rights and Freedoms. We have rights in this country, but to be told by a state official that your child can't play in the park, it would be so easy and wrong for us to laugh at the ludicrousness of that. But as we've seen, there's some tragic repercussions that have followed from that, because information was on file, Derek was troublesome, and he's now paying the price. And we all pay the price when rights of one of our fellow citizens are violated, because what was taken from him can be taken from us. So perhaps it's best that the lawyers weren't here today and that we heard some stories from people who have suffered at the hands of the state. Before I turn things over to some discussion with our audience, I just have one question which I'd like to pose to both of our speakers, because you did address it in your talk. I'd like to hear from you. We'll hear, first of all, let's see, since Lyndon, you went first, we'll hear from Derek first. What changes, Derek, if any, would you like to see made to provincial legislation that pertains to children in need of protection? And please, could I ask you to limit your response to 3 to 5 minutes? I know we can talk about this all day, but try to be brief.
Okay, well, first of all, on aggregate, I would say that the entire act, in my province, British Columbia, it's called the CFCSA, the Community, Family, or the Child, Family, and Community Service Act. I think it should just be scrapped, personally. Now, if I were to be posed the question, okay, well, let's hypothetically say we're not going to just scrap it, or we're not going to advocate for scrapping it, what changes should it make? The first clause I would remove from this is the liability protections. The reality is that social workers are held to what's called a good faith standard. That means that a social worker can walk in and can say, I thought it was what was best for the child. They're not held to any negligence standard, which some locations do have. So they can basically do whatever they want as long as, in good faith, they believed what they were doing was best for the child. And it becomes nearly impossible to prove otherwise. I also really don't, it doesn't sit well with me that I'm not sitting in jail right now. The reality is, if you're going to take my kid, okay, but you're not going to charge me with anything, right? Like, you're saying I haven't done anything which denotes a crime, but I don't have my kid. I'll tell you, I'd rather sit in jail any day than sit a day without my kids the way this has gone down. It strikes me as very odd that the standard of evidence being held at these sorts of hearings is preponderance of the evidence. And at a criminal hearing, it would be beyond a reasonable doubt that they can remove your children. Those would be the two biggest things, would be the standard of evidence and the liability protections for the workers.
Thanks, Derek.
It's a good question, because I can cite an example of a request we actually made about a year ago, and the we being not just Autism Calgary, but the collective of analogous groups across Alberta under the auspice of Autism Society Alberta. We wrote a letter to the Minister of Children's Services at the time, which is now merged under the Super Ministry of Human Services, a request to meet, in particular to talk about the challenges families face securing the intensive models of intervention that are researched to support children with autism. In Alberta, we probably have one of the best legislations for intensive supports for autism in Canada, but the reality of being the family and caregiver is you're not even told those services exist unless you learn from another family, and you need to know how to ask for it, and you need to know how to fight for that yearly. For my son, I've launched 3 provincial appeal hearings. He's now 14, has secured another year of funding, but it's taken multiple, an intensive understanding of the legislation, my rights for advocacy. So in any case, going back on topic, a collective of us requested specific changes to the process in place that live up to, holding them accountable to some really great legislation to try and make this system more accountable and make those supports a little bit easier for families so that we're not put through torture fighting for it. In that as well, we requested changes to legislation to introduce a construct analogous to child protection, which is the children's advocate. The children's advocate has been not effective, but has actually been effective in a particular case where I supported a family of a foster child. a family of a foster child who chose not to do adoption because they saw that the services might drop for their autistic child under their foster care. They became such strong advocates, and they were being offered very inadequate supports, and we helped them to articulate. Their child was offered much less supports than my son, of similar function level. It was absurd. For a child under the protection of the state, I could not understand why this child wouldn't be awarded the same supports as my child. The Children's Advocate Department was actually effective. My voice wasn't heard, the parents who were heard, but that body did have influence. So we have asked the Minister of Children's Services to introduce the Family Advocate, which would allow families unable and with no capacity to fight some protection to ensure that social services that are meant to be in place are put in place before child protection are involved, so that they can secure the intensive interventions. You know, for example, of Derek's family, why did they not explore what social systems, why didn't they offer social work or family counseling, why didn't they offer them parenting skill classes if they felt that was it? You know, we would eventually swallow our pride. We'd think, okay, I think I'm a good parent, but I'll go with that, but can you also give me psychology and a psychoeducational assessment for the teachers so that they actually do some education in the school? You know, we will do that. But we sometimes, particularly when I mentioned the single mothers, the single fathers, they don't know their rights. No one is telling them. Nobody wants us to know them because it makes their job a little bit too hard sometimes. A family advocate might be an answer. That was certainly one solution we offered the province. They said, interesting idea, we'll do that.
Okay, thanks, Lyndon. Well, because we weren't able to patch the lawyer in for some technical reasons, that's freed up some more time for discussion. So before we get into that, though, I had neglected to state at the outset that as a civil liberties research organization, we obviously are interested in hearing from all sides on a matter, and I did in fact contact the Calgary Region Office of Children and Family Services of Alberta several weeks ago, invited them to come. I only heard back from the manager yesterday by email, and he said, regrettably, nobody's available to come and speak to you. So they were invited to come, so I did my diligent best to bring them here. We do have now 45 minutes for discussion, so please, and please, if you're an advocate working for children, please identify the group you're with. We'd like to hear from you. This gentleman here first.
Okay. I'm Thomas Webb. I'm the founder of Alberta Child and Family First and Child and Family First across the country. This is Bob Weed, which is the Association's public relations expert and my right-hand person. Yeah. Okay. I will tell you right now, I suffer with Gillies Tourette syndrome, so if I start swearing, twitching, or anything strange things,
well, I'm American.
Hopefully you'll understand.
Blue language, yeah. Don't worry about it.
Hopefully you'll understand.
I'll smack you.
Right. I personally have been fighting with child services for 7 years for the guardianship of 5 of my grandchildren. Yeah. But that's not what we're about. Alberta Child and Family First is about gaining the rights and changing the ways that child services operates. Not for one faction of foster children, but for all foster children, for all parents, yeah? And we are gaining, right? We had meetings with the Deputy Minister and the Director of Child Services just last month. We have a meeting with the Chief Executive Officers this month, isn't it? November, sorry. So, and we put in a list of changes that we wanted, and several of them changes are made right now. The Children's Advocate has been separated away from child services. The next phase for that is to get all child service workers removed from the Children's Advocate because they're biased. Yeah, and we found that out not only through our site but through personal things. Yeah, the other thing, one that's happened is we asked for bonuses to be taken away from the child service workers. There should be no money involved or bonuses involved where children are concerned. Yeah? None. There's no reason for somebody to get a bonus for taking a child away.
Sorry, Mr. Webb, what do you mean by bonuses? I've never heard
Child
that.
services gets bonuses, right, for the way, for apprehension, right? They get bonuses for how many children they get into adoption, right? How many children are into foster care, right? Most of child services is run by a private company, right? You obviously you know that, do you?
No.
All right, Tri-West owns AATIS. AATIS owns CBM, innit?
CBI,
CBI,
That's for you.
and they're all involved with
foster
child
care,
foster care
supervision.
Supervision.
and all of it, all right, except for the apprehension side. The apprehension side is run by the government, but foster care, right, and everything else is run by these companies. Right, so they make money out of it. 4 years ago, they were collecting $54,000 per year per child, and they were paying out possibly $12,000 a year per child
Yep.
to the foster parents.
So what does that say about the best interest of the child that we have
Nothing.
profit-driven
Nothing.
motive?
It says
Nothing.
they're
Child,
commodity.
let me explain this. Child Services has got no care about children's. Oh, they'll stand up and say the best interest of the child, but it's not, right? And from my personal experiences, right, I've been in court 7 years fighting for my grandchildren. That should show somebody that I give a damn. They've got no legal reason ever to take my grandchildren from us or to stop us having the grandchildren. None. But they come up in court because we don't like them. Poor babies, yeah? Or we won't work with them. Well, I get guardianship, I don't have to. But they're the things they do. Apparently I'm aggressive.
I'd like to chat with you some more about this after our session.